My name is Morgan Hale, and at my cousin's wedding, I was told I wasn't worthy to walk through the door until the groom turned, saw my face, and nearly fell backward. Jesus Christ, he breathed, voice cracking through the hush of pearls and polished shoes. She is my general. It started with the thud of my father's palm on the oak frame, a sound that cut through string quartet music and the whisper of silk. He planted himself like a sentry in a charcoal suit that cost more than my first car. "Don't you dare step inside." He spat the words bright with whiskey and pride. "You're not worthy." Gasps rippled down the entry hall of the country club. White trim magnolia centerpieces, programs printed in looping gold script. Guests moved aside the way people sometimes do around a street violinist or a confrontation in a grocery store, curious, guilty, eager to see. The groom in dress blues turned at the commotion, confusion knitting his handsome face. "Sir, what's happening?" His voice carried the clipped certainty of someone used to commands answered quickly. My father tipped his chin toward me like I was a stain he'd found on a cuff. "A shame to my name, sir." He liked addressing men like that. Sir, especially men from families he wanted to court, men with plaques on hospital wings and last names that got you tables without a reservation. He wanted what they had and believed I stood in the way. I could feel every eye on me, the prodigal daughter returned to ruin the seating chart. I wore a simple navy dress and low heels hair, pinned back the only jewelry, a thin gold chain that had belonged to my mother. I hadn't worn a uniform. Not today. Not for family. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon oil and the buttercream frosting drifting from the reception ballroom. Someone near the coat rack whispered, "Who is she?" Someone else murmured, "I heard she ran off." In my father's version of my life, I had always run off. The groom took a step closer, and his confusion shifted to a frown, then to a stare that sharpened, like a lens snapping into focus. His mouth opened, the color drained from his face. He staggered back a pace, boots scraping the marble. "General Hale," he said, not much louder than breath. "Ma'am?" His hand twitched as if fighting the instinct to salute. Silence held the room, the way a hand holds a match right before it either lights or is snuffed. One of the groomsmen blinked, looking between us. An elderly guest touched her pearls. The quartet faltered, bowstrings fluttering. My father's eyes flicked from the groom to me and back again, like a man reading a report that didn't match his expectations. For a heartbeat, his mouth softened, then hardened twice as much. He turned fully toward the groom, searching for solid ground. "She doesn't belong here," he hissed. "This is a private family affair." I could have listed the things that made the affair mine: to attend the cousin who had shared summers with me on cracked lake docks, the aunt who had pressed pie into my hands when my mother's chemo finally failed, the years I'd bought gifts and sent cards even as invitations stopped arriving. I could have said I didn't come to fight. I came to bless. But older folks in the hallway, men with the stoop of time, women with kind eyes were already looking past my father to me, the way people lean toward a truth they recognize before they can name it. The groom found his balance and his voice. "Sir," he said to my father, respectful but steel-edged now, "if you'll excuse me." He stepped around him and faced me squarely. Close up, I saw the faint shadow of nerves beneath his readiness. "Ma'am," he said again, straighter, like the word was a compass. He swallowed a smile of disbelief. "It's an honor." I didn't rescue him with familiarity. We had never met, but I had signed promotion orders that had touched his chain of command. I had read his name on a commendation that had crossed my desk in a quiet, windowless office, where the coffee was always burnt and the stakes were never small. I knew the shape of his service, the way you can know a coastline. You've never walked by maps, by reports, by the lives that brush against it. "It's your day, Lieutenant," I said softly. "Congratulations." My father gave a scornful laugh that didn't find an audience. The guests, sensing tides turning inch toward the groom's gravity. Two older men in blue blazers stood near the door. Veterans, their posture told me, even if their knees told a different story. One touched the brim of an invisible cap and nodded to me. Respect is a simple thing when it's true. I could feel heat rising beneath my collarbone, not from shame, but from the old ache of being 13, and told not to wear sneakers to the kitchen 17, and told my mother's kindness had made me weak 21, and told the only thing the world respected was money. My father had believed shame was a tool that could sculpt a daughter into a weapon that suited him. He had never considered that shame turned sideways becomes spine. "Move your hand, Dad," I said, steady as a yardstick. "People need to get to their seats." "Not until you leave," he snapped louder now, performing for an audience that had already changed channels. "Sir," the groom said, stepping back to my side, "with all respect, she's an honored guest." He looked to the coordinator, hovering near the program table, a young woman with a headset, in the tired eyes of anyone working weekends. "Please show the general to the front row next to family." That did it. The hallway released its breath in a rustle of whispers. My father's face went pale, then flush a color that used to precede shouting matches and slam doors. He didn't move. So I did. I stepped around him. The groom extended his arm, the smallest courtesy, the oldest bridge, and I took it not because I needed support, but because it told the room what needed saying. As we passed, a woman in a floral dress touched my elbow and whispered, "Thank you for your service," with the softness of someone who knows the price. Inside the chapel, the air was cool and smelled faintly of lilac. Sunlight fell through stained glass in squares of color on the aisle runner. My cousin turned as the coordinator motioned us forward. Her eyes, already bright with nerves and happiness, widened when she saw me. For a second, she was 9 again, and I was 11, and we were building forts out of quilts. She mouthed my name. I mouthed, "You look beautiful." It was not a reconciliation, not yet. But it was the kind of look people carry into their old age, take out like a photograph when the house is quiet. We reached the front row. The groom squeezed my hand, once a soldier's shorthand, for it's handled. I folded the program on my lap, and let the quartet find their place again. Outside, I heard the muffled scrape of my father's soles as he finally stepped aside. Pride can make a man heavy. Truth can move him anyway. I didn't look back. Not yet. There would be time for that. Time to talk, to say the words we never said when my mother was alive. Time to measure the distance between the man he chose to be and the man he could still become. But part 1 of any battle is knowing when not to fight. When the officiant asked the room to stand for the bride, we rose as one. The doors opened. Light poured in like a blessing. The scent of lilac and candle wax lingered in the chapel as the ceremony began. But my mind was still back in the hallway, with my father's hand braced against the door. It would have been easier to pretend it never happened, to lose myself in the rhythm of vows and hymns, but I could feel the tremor of it running through me, the way old wounds ache in a storm. As my cousin walked down the aisle, radiant in white lace, I smiled for her. She deserved joy, not the heavy shadow of family discord. Yet even in that moment, I couldn't help but drift into memory, because if you want to understand why that hallway confrontation mattered, you have to know where it began. I grew up in a house with wide porches and cold rooms. My father had made his millions in real estate, and he wore his success like a badge carved out of granite. The house itself felt like a monument to him. White columns, polished floors, every picture frame angled just so. My mother had softened the edges while she was alive, filling the kitchen with warmth and laughter, baking cornbread on Sundays, and slipping me notes in my lunchbox. But when cancer took her before I finished high school, the house grew colder still. My father filled the silence with scorn. "You'll never measure up," he told me more times than I could count. "You think discipline comes from wearing boots and running laps? Discipline comes from making money, from being somebody." He'd glance at my report cards and sigh as if straight A's weren't enough. "Books don't build empires," he'd mutter. And when I talked about college or service, he laughed, "Waste of time. You'll come crawling back when the world shows you how it works." I learned early to stop arguing. Words didn't change his mind. They only fueled his temper. What I didn't stop was dreaming. While my friends talked about sororities and scholarships, I stared at recruiting posters, the kind with bold block letters and silhouettes of soldiers against the sunset. I wasn't naive. I knew the military wasn't a fairy tale. But I craved structure, honor, something bigger than the endless calculations of my father's investments. I wanted to earn respect, not inherit it. There were moments that should have been milestones, a science fair win, a varsity letter acceptance into honor society. Each one I brought home like an offering. Each one he dismissed. Cute, he'd say, pouring himself a drink. But how does that pay the bills? The day I told him I was considering the Navy, he slammed his glass down so hard the ice cracked. "You," he sneered. "You'll wash out in a week. Don't embarrass yourself." The ache of those words settled deep. But sometimes rejection is fertilizer. It buries you, yes, but it also feeds you. I decided if I was going to leave, I would leave completely. I would carve my own path without looking back for his approval. I didn't want his empire of mortgages and country clubs. I wanted a life I could be proud of. Still, there were nights when doubt crept in. I'd sit on the back porch where my mother used to hum gospel songs while shelling peas, and I'd wonder if I was fooling myself. Could I really make it? Did I have what it took? The house around me was heavy with his judgment, but in those quiet moments, I felt her presence, as if her voice whispered, "Go, be who you are." It was enough to steel me. At school, my teachers saw a determination my father never cared to notice. My guidance counselor called me stubborn in the best way. Friends teased me for running extra laps at practice, for always pushing, always reaching. They didn't know I was training not just my body, but my spirit. Every mile I ran was one more step away from the house where love had been rationed like bread. Family gatherings only deepened the divide. At Thanksgiving, he praised my cousins, the ones studying law or joining the family business. He would clink his glass, boasting about their internships or golf tournaments. When conversation shifted to me, he shrugged. "She's still figuring herself out," he'd say, dismissing me like a smudge on the silverware. My cheeks would burn, but I kept quiet. I learned silence was a shield. By the time my 18th birthday rolled around, the decision was set. I enlisted. My father's fury was volcanic. "You'll regret this," he barked, pacing the den. "You're throwing away your future." But to me, it felt like claiming it. When the recruiter shook my hand, it was the first time in years I felt seen. Not as a disappointment, not as a shame, as a soldier in the making. Leaving home wasn't just about running toward the Navy. It was about leaving behind the crushing weight of a man who believed worth was measured in bank accounts and banquet invitations. It was about proving to myself, if not to him, that dignity is built, not bought. And so when I walked into that chapel years later, and he tried to block my path with the same words he'd always used, unworthy shame, nothing, I wasn't the same girl he had dismissed. I carried with me not just the scars of training, but the memory of every night I'd chosen resilience over despair. That hallway confrontation wasn't born in a moment. It was the echo of a lifetime. The first weeks of training stripped me bare in ways I hadn't imagined. Gone were the polished floors and cocktail parties of my father's world. In their place, sand in my boots, salt water stinging my eyes, and the relentless cadence of instructors whose voices could cut through bone. The Navy didn't care who my father was. It didn't care about family fortunes or reputations. It cared about grit, about who could push past the point where others quit. Day one at Bud S, we hit the surf. The Pacific slapped me, cold, stole the breath from my lungs, and made my muscles seize. Men twice my size dropped out before dawn, hunched over gasping. I clenched my jaw, dug my fingers into the wet sand, and told myself, not me. Not today. I wasn't the fastest. I wasn't the strongest. But I refused to be the first to break. That stubborn streak my father hated became my shield. The days blurred push-ups until my arms shook like branches carrying logs that dug splinters into my shoulders, running miles with boots that seemed to gain weight with every step. There were moments when my body screamed for mercy, when I could almost hear my father's laugh in the back of my mind. "I told you you'd wash out." those taunts kept me going. Every insult he'd hurled became fuel. If pain was the language of training, then defiance was my translation. Hell Week tested more than muscle. It tested soul. 5 days of near-constant exertion, shivering in drenched uniforms, eyes burning from lack of sleep. I hallucinated, once saw my mother's face in the foam of the surf, smiling like she used to when she brought me hot cocoa after practice. I whispered to her, "I'm still here, Mom. I won't stop." That image carried me through the darkness. And when we finally emerged battered, but standing, I discovered something unexpected. Respect. Not from everyone. There were plenty who doubted a woman belonged in the program, but from those who mattered. The ones who saw me carry more than my share, who saw me refuse to quit when quitting would have been easier. It wasn't loud. It was quiet. A nod here, a seat offered on the chow hall bench. It was enough. Promotion came slowly, but it came. Each pin, each ribbon represented nights spent away from comfort, days surviving heat and cold moments when courage meant acting despite fear. I carried my team, and they carried me. I learned that leadership isn't about barking orders, it's about earning trust one decision at a time. By the time I wore a commander's insignia, the same men who had once doubted me stood shoulder to shoulder, without question. Still back home, my father's disdain never softened. Letters went unanswered. Phone calls were curt-clipped, always ending with some jab about wasting my life in uniform. Once on leave, I stopped by the house. He opened the door, glanced at my dress blues, and said, "Play acting doesn't impress me." Then he shut the door. I stood there on the porch metals, glinting against my chest, and realized nothing I achieved would ever shift his view. He had built his empire on control, and my independence was a threat he couldn't tolerate. So I stopped looking for his approval. My victories weren't for him. They were for the sailors who trusted me, for the mothers who wrote letters of thanks, for the flag-draped coffins that reminded me every day why service mattered. And maybe, maybe for the girl I once was the one who sat on the porch hearing whispers of doubt and chose to stand anyway. Years stacked like bricks, missions completed, commands rotated, until the day came when I pinned on a star, then another. General, a title my father would scoff at, but one that carried weight far heavier than his millions. I had carved out a life, measured not in stock portfolios, but in lives safeguarded in honor earned. And yet the wound of his scorn never fully healed. Even in the glow of respect from my peers, even in the quiet pride of leading men and women braver than most could imagine, a part of me still carried the echo of his voice, "Not worthy." Shame to my name. It's funny how those words stick, how they wait for moments to resurface. And that is why, when I stepped into my cousin's wedding years later, and he blocked the door with the same sneer, I felt the past collide with the present. He hadn't changed, but I had. The Navy taught me something my father never did, that dignity doesn't come from tearing others down. It comes from rising when others expect you to fall. It comes from carrying yourself with honor even when no one is watching, especially then. My father never understood subtlety. To him, every connection was a rung on a ladder, every social event a transaction. By the time I had risen in the Navy, he had carved himself deeper into the circles of wealth and prestige, chasing handshakes with senators and golf games with CEOs. If there was a table with powerful men seated around it, he wanted a chair, even if it meant shoving his own family aside to make room. I heard about his schemes through relatives. A new development deal in Charlotte, a donation to some university that bought him a plaque, and lately, his obsession with the Lancaster family, the Groom's family. Old money military pedigree, the kind of last name that opened doors before you even knocked. My cousin's engagement to Lieutenant James Lancaster was in my father's eyes, not just a happy union, it was a golden ticket. He could already see himself toasting with admirals, inserting my son-in-law's family into conversations at the club, using their shine to polish his own tarnished pride. At Sunday dinners, he bragged about it to anyone who would listen. The Lancasters, he'd say, puffing up his chest, now that is a family worth knowing. Distinguished, decorated, respectable. He made a point of emphasizing that word respectable like a dagger meant for me. Never mind that I was serving my country. In his eyes, respect came only with lineage and money, not sacrifice. When the wedding plans took shape, he inserted himself at every turn. He wanted it grand cathedral ceilings, chandeliers, imported champagne. He wanted senators on the guest list and businessmen flown in from across the state. My cousin, sweet and mild, only nodded along, overwhelmed by his force. And all the while, I received silence. No invitation arrived in my mailbox. No call. Just secondhand whispers that Morgan won't be necessary. It stung not because I craved the spectacle, but because family is supposed to mean something even when it doesn't glitter. But I had a bond with my cousin that went deeper than my father's ambitions. She called me in secret one evening, her voice hushed but urgent. "Please come," she said. "You've always been there for me. I don't care what Uncle says. You're my family. I want you there." That was all I needed. I didn't go for my father. I went for her. Still, I knew what awaited me. I could already picture the sneer on his face, the way he'd use my presence to perform his disdain for his new in-laws. "She's the black sheep," he'd say. Smirking never could keep up with the rest of us. I could practically hear the words before he spoke them. But I wasn't the girl he used to dismiss. I was a general in the United States Navy. I had commanded men into fire and brought them back alive. His insults couldn't strip that from me. The day of the wedding dawned warm, the kind of Carolina morning where sunlight turns the magnolias into lanterns. I put on a simple dress, nothing flashy, nothing to draw attention. I pinned up my hair, slipped on my mother's gold chain, and looked at myself in the mirror. Not a soldier today, not in uniform, just a woman coming to honor her cousin. I rehearsed in my mind how I would handle him calmly with dignity. If he tried to humiliate me, I would let it wash over like rain on stone. The venue was a country club dressed for royalty, white columns wrapped in garlands, tables gleaming with crystal, the air thick with perfume, and the sweet scent of roses. Guests arrived in designer suits and tailored dresses, their voices a low hum of gossip and admiration. I walked up the steps, steady my heels clicking against the marble. Heads turned, some curious, some surprised. A few eyes widened in recognition my service had found its way into newspapers now and then, but most just saw me as another guest. Then he appeared blocking the entry like a sentinel. My father. Charcoal suit pressed sharp tie, perfectly knotted smile already twisting into a sneer. He looked me over the way a man inspects a stray dog on his lawn. And with a palm flat against the oak door, he spat the words I had braced myself to hear. "Don't step inside. You're not worthy." I froze, not from fear, but from the sting of déjà vu. The words were the same he'd hurled at me all my life. Unworthy, shameful, a disgrace. Only now he said them not in the privacy of our home, but in front of senators, bankers, and the Lancaster family. He meant to bury me beneath humiliation. He didn't realize the soil he used was the very ground from which I had risen. The groom stepped closer, confusion written across his face. "Sir?" he asked. "What's happening here?" My father's voice dripped with contempt as he turned to him. "Ashamed to my name, that's what. She doesn't belong here." He thought he was protecting his status. He didn't know he was about to shatter it. The air outside the ballroom was thick with tension. My father's hand still pressed against the door, his voice carrying across the marble like a gavel. "She doesn't belong here," he repeated, daring anyone to challenge him. The groom, Lieutenant James Lancaster, shifted his weight. He wasn't just a groom in a polished uniform. He was a soldier, trained to read situations under pressure. His brow-furrowed eyes narrowing as he studied me. Then came the pause, the recognition dawning. His mouth parted, the color draining from his face. He stumbled back a step. "General Hale," he whispered, the syllables hushed but sharp enough to slice the silence. Gasps rose from the guests who'd gathered. Someone dropped a program. A woman clutched her pearls. The veterans in the crowd, men in their 60s and 70s with stooped shoulders and steady eyes, straightened like they'd been given an order. One even pressed a trembling hand to his forehead in a salute. My father blinked stunned for half a heartbeat before scoffing. "General," he mocked, turning the word sour. "She parades around in a uniform, that's all. Don't be fooled." But the groom didn't laugh. His spine locked, his voice ringing louder now. "Sir, with respect, this woman isn't just parading. She commands respect across the United States Navy. She's earned every star on her shoulder." His gaze shifted back to me, his expression one of disbelief and awe. "It's an honor to have you here." My father's jaw twitched. He glanced around at the faces now fixed on me, the admiration spreading through the room like wildfire. His power built on reputation and intimidation was slipping with every second. I stood still, letting the moment breathe. Years of training had taught me not to rush when silence spoke louder than words. My calm contrasted with his anger, and the difference painted its own truth. "Morgan!" My cousin's voice called softly from just beyond the archway. She stood in her bridal gown veil cascading over her shoulders, eyes wide with surprise and joy. "You came." "I wouldn't miss it," I said, offering her a small smile. The groom took a decisive step toward me, snapping to attention, before bowing his head slightly, the gesture both formal and deeply personal. "Ma'am," he said again, voice firm, "this time, this wedding is honored by your presence." The guests erupted into murmurs. Some whispered my name. Others shared fragments of my service they must have read in newspapers, words like Afghanistan, decorated first female SEAL general. None of it mattered in that moment, though. What mattered was the respect in their eyes. My father's face flushed crimson. He opened his mouth perhaps to bark another insult, but the words tangled in his throat. He looked smaller, then cornered, not by my defiance, but by the undeniable truth reflected back at him from everyone else. I took a slow step forward. "Move your hand, Dad," I said evenly. "The only shame here is how you've treated your own blood." For the first time in years, he had no retort. His hand dropped heavy and reluctant from the door. The groom extended his arm to me, the smallest of courtesies, but it carried the weight of something far greater. I accepted not because I needed it, but because it signaled to everyone present that I belonged. Together, we stepped into the ballroom. As we entered, the string quartet hesitated, then shifted seamlessly into music again. Guests rose from their seats, some out of respect for the bride, others because the moment demanded acknowledgement. I caught glimpses an old colonel, nodding a senator's wife, dabbing her eyes, a child staring at me with wide-eyed wonder. I walked with my head high, not triumphant but steady. My cousin's smile broke into tears as she mouthed, "Thank you." Behind us, I heard my father's shoes scrape against the marble, his pride dragging him like a weight he couldn't drop. He followed, but no longer as a gatekeeper, only as a guest, stripped of the authority he'd wielded like a weapon. That day, in the glow of chandeliers and vows, the power shifted. For the first time, it wasn't his fortune or influence that defined our family in the public eye. It was integrity. It was service. It was dignity that couldn't be bought or borrowed. And as I sat near the front next to family who finally saw me for who I was, I realized the confrontation at the door hadn't just been about a wedding. It was the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. My father had spent a lifetime calling me unworthy. But in that room, surrounded by witnesses, he could no longer make the world believe it. The ceremony went on as planned, vows spoken under the shimmer of chandeliers and the quiet sigh of magnolia blossoms drifting in through the open doors. My cousin's smile steadied the room, but the true current was in the glances, the way guests kept stealing looks at me, at my father, and back again. The story of that hallway confrontation had already traveled faster than the bride's procession. I didn't crave attention. Years of service had taught me that recognition often comes in silence, in the lives saved rather than the medals pinned. But here, in this ballroom, where wealth and lineage usually dictated respect, something different unfolded. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, applause rippled. But I saw it, eyes lingering on me, whispers of General Hale lacing through the claps. At the reception, the shift became impossible to ignore. Veterans in the crowd approached me quietly, one after another. A gray-haired Marine with a cane shook my hand firmly, his voice trembling. "Ma'am, it's an honor." A widow pressed my palm, whispering, "My husband served under your command. He always said you were the best leader he ever had." These weren't formalities. They were confessions of truth. The groom himself stood tall beside me. He raised a glass when guests gathered near. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, voice steady but charged. "Today isn't just a union of families, it's an honor for me personally, because today I had the privilege of welcoming to this wedding one of the finest leaders our Navy has ever seen, General Hale." The room erupted in applause cheers, scraping as people rose instinctively to their feet. Some saluted, others clapped until their palms turned red. My father, caught in the middle, looked as though the floor had given way beneath him. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no words came. His empire of pride built on belittling me had collapsed in the span of a few sentences. I stood not to boast but to acknowledge. "Thank you," I said simply, my voice carrying across the hall. "But this day is not about me. It's about love, about family, and about honoring the people who stand by us through joy and hardship." I let my eyes sweep across the room, pausing just long enough on my father to make the point without speaking it. He shifted uncomfortably, cheeks pale under the glow of the chandeliers. For once, he couldn't sneer his way out. The groom's salute, the veteran's nods, the murmurs of respect, none of it could be bought. None of it could be denied. Later, when the music swelled and couples filled the dance floor, I slipped outside for air. The night was cool, the stars sharp against the Carolina sky. I leaned on the railing, listening to the faint hum of laughter inside. A man approached. It was the groom, his posture still formal, even out here. "General," he said, with the kind of reverence most reserved for prayer. "Forgive me for the scene earlier. I didn't know." "You couldn't have," I cut in gently. "It wasn't your burden to carry." "But it was your father's," he said quietly. His jaw tightened, and he failed it. Miserably. I didn't answer. Sometimes silence is its own agreement. Through the glass doors, I caught sight of my father, lingering alone, his drink untouched. For the first time in my life, he looked small, stripped of his armor of arrogance. I felt no triumph, only a tired kind of clarity. His power had never been real. Respect built on money and fear is fragile. Respect built on service endures. When I returned inside, my cousin ran to embrace me, tears streaking her cheeks. "You saved this day," she whispered. "He would have ruined it if not for you." "No," I said softly, pulling back to look at her. "You saved it, by loving without conditions." That's something he never learned. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of toasts and music, but the echo of that moment stayed with me, the weight of 100 eyes turning toward me. The sound of applause meant not for wealth, but for sacrifice. My father sat stiffly in the corner, his empire crumbling in silence, while I stood surrounded by dignity he could never command. And for the first time, I realized revenge didn't always need shouting or spectacle. Sometimes the quiet acknowledgement of truth in front of witnesses was enough. When the band eased into a slow number and the chatter softened to a warm murmur, I found my father alone at a table near the back. His tie loosened his gaze, fixed on a water ring spreading across the linen. For years, I'd imagined confrontation, sharp words. Verdicts rendered the gavel of my anger, striking oak. Instead, I felt something quieter approach the way. Evening finds a front porch, not an argument, a knocking. He didn't see me at first. The ballroom lights carved hollows under his eyes, and without an audience, he looked older, less like a mogul, more like a man whose scaffolding had finally been taken down. When he glanced up and met my gaze, the familiar defenses twitched to life and then faltered. His mouth opened. No words came. "Let's step outside," I said gently. We walked onto the veranda where the night smelled of cut grass and roses. Beyond the rail, the parking lot lights glowed like a distant constellation. Inside, laughter swelled and softened, the soundtrack of a good day trying to overcome a bad habit. He cleared his throat. "You made quite a scene," he said, the old edge peeking out. "Then quieter, I suppose I did too." "Scenes end," I said. "Choices stay." He winced. I was surprised. He chuckled without humor. "That's not the word. I've been wrong, Morgan." He reached for the railing, a steadying touch. "I've been wrong for a long time." The apology, unfinished, imperfect, hung between us. I waited. A lifetime of briefings had taught me that silence can pull truth out of a person better than any interrogation. "I thought the world was a scoreboard," he went on. "Houses, deals, names on plaques. I thought I could protect this family by climbing high enough nobody could push us. Your mother," his voice thinned. "She believed different. Said what mattered was who we were when the neighbors weren't watching." He swallowed. "When she died, I doubled down on the wrong lesson." I looked past him to the shadowed lawn, where as kids my cousin and I had once chased fireflies at some other wedding in some other summer. "You didn't just pick the wrong lesson," I said. "You picked the wrong measure. I kept trying to hand you a different ruler." He nodded, eyes glossy. "I called your service a costume." He rubbed his temple. "God forgive me. A beat. If you can't, I'll understand." I thought of the porch where he'd shut the door in my face, of the metals that flashed in the crack of sunlight as the latch clicked. I thought of the recruits I'd seen become leaders because someone believed they could. I thought of the mothers who wrote me in careful cursive to say thank you for bringing their sons home. And I thought of my mother humming over cornbread, telling me that dignity is how you hold your head when no one is clapping. "Forgiveness isn't clearance," I said. "It's not a pass to keep doing the same harm." I exhaled, watched it cloud in the cooler air. "But I can meet you halfway across this bridge if you'll walk the other half." He closed his eyes, relief and grief mixing like rain. "Tell me how." "Start with truth," I said. "You don't have to like my life. You do have to respect it. Stop using shame as a hammer. Learn the names of the people you hurt. Practice saying, 'I'm sorry' without an asterisk." I let a small smile find me. "And maybe throw your weight behind something that isn't your reflection. Scholarships for kids who serve quiet ones without your name on them." He barked a laugh that turned into a cough. "Quiet ones? That'll be new?" "Good. New is where change lives." We stood in companionable silence for a while. The door opened and the groom slipped out to check on us. He hovered uncertain, then offered a respectful nod. "Sir? Ma'am?" My father, stripped of performance, nodded back. When the groom had gone inside, my father sighed. "He saw you. The way I should have." "It's easier to see strangers," I said. "They don't carry your fear." "My fear? That I'd prove you wrong about what mattered." I shrugged. "I did, but it didn't have to cost this much." He studied the railing. "Can we start again?" "Not again," I said. "We can start from here." He straightened his tie, the old habit softening into something almost tender. From here, he repeated, testing the words. We returned to the ballroom. My cousin caught my eye, question marks bright in her expression. I gave her a small nod. The band launched into an old Sam Cooke tune, and to everyone's surprise, including mine, my father asked Will, "You dance with your old man?" The sentence wobbled on the last word. I thought of all the slow dances we'd skipped in the kitchen when I was little, of all the father-daughter moments that had been traded for ledger lines. I took his hand. We moved stiffly at first. He stepped on my toes, once muttered an apology, and then got the hang of it. People watched, of course they did, but their faces were soft, the way folks look when they witness a small miracle they didn't expect to see. Over my father's shoulder, I saw the veterans at the back nodding, as if saluting not rank, but repair. When the song ended, my father squeezed my hand and cleared his throat into the microphone the DJ had offered. For a heartbeat, I tensed, bracing for a speech laden with polish. Instead, he said, "I owe my daughter an apology. I've spent years confusing wealth with worth, image with honor. Tonight I learned what many of you already knew." He looked at me. Dignity isn't bought. It's earned. I intend to spend what time I have left, earning it back from the people I love. No applause followed. No one needed it. The quiet was better a kind of reverence that settles over a room when a truth fits perfectly into place. Later, on the same veranda, my father touched the gold chain at my throat, the one that had belonged to my mother. She would have been proud, he said. She wanted us both to be, I answered. The night-thinned guests drifted away, and the staff began their quiet ballet of stacking chairs and sweeping confetti that glinted like frost. I helped gather centerpieces to send to the retirement home down the road. The groom and my cousin boxed cake for the kitchen crew. My father carried vases without complaint. No speeches, no spotlight, just ordinary kindness, ground-level work where character strengthens its roots. By the time we said our goodbyes, the moon had climbed high. My father lingered near my car. I don't know how to be different overnight, he admitted. But I can learn, if you'll keep telling me when I'm getting it wrong. I will, I said. And when you get it right? He smiled, a small, unfamiliar thing. From here, he repeated, and this time, it sounded like a promise instead of a wish. Driving home, the road a ribbon of silver under the headlights, I thought about the strange arithmetic of revenge. How the loudest victories are sometimes the least satisfying, and how the quiet ones respect earned in the open, an apology with its teeth in it, a dance that arrives 30 years late. Settle deeper. We talk a lot in the service about after-action reports. What went right, what failed, what we'd do again. If I wrote one for that night, I'd put this in the lessons learned column. You can't shame someone into virtue. You can only stand in yours long enough that they notice the light. For those listening who know the ache of family disappointment, who have been called unworthy by people who should have protected you, hear me, your worth isn't a vote taken at a banquet. It's built quietly. Choice by choice in rooms where no one's clapping. Don't let anyone rent space in your soul with their insecurity. Love people enough to set boundaries. And if a door gets blocked, remember, you can still walk around it. If this story stirred something, if you thought of a call you need to make a grudge, you could loosen a veteran, you might think do it. Share this with someone who needs the nudge. And if you want more stories about finding dignity in ordinary American life, about healing, without forgetting, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe and stay with me on this road. There's room on the veranda for all of us.